time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The conversation was supposed to remain controlled. Instead, one demand pushed King Charles beyond patience. Meghan wanted a renewed formal connection to the monarchy, recognition that would allow her to retain a defined royal-facing role despite the Sussexes' departure from official duties. Charles listened, lowered the papers in front of him, and delivered one word that changed the temperature instantly: enough. But what happened moments later, when Harry learned his father's answer, turned rejection into open family warfare. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept his voice low, but the decision carried weight. Meghan was asking for permission to take part in selected royal initiatives while keeping an institutional connection to the crown. A royal initiative is an official project or public duty carried out with palace approval. Since Harry and Meghan stepped away from working royal duties, every question about titles, access, patronages, security, and representation had become more than paperwork. Each one touched identity, loyalty, and royal authority. The king heard the argument to the end. Then he placed his pen beside the unsigned proposal and pushed the papers back across the table. He did not celebrate. He looked exhausted. Charles understood what the refusal would mean to Meghan, and he knew what it would trigger in Harry. Still, he said the matter was finished. He instructed his aides not to reopen the same request through another channel. There would be no second route, no rewritten version, no private negotiation to soften the answer. Meghan absorbed the decision as something larger than a failed request. The message was unmistakable. The palace was drawing a permanent boundary around her future royal identity. She had not asked to return to full-time royal duty. She had asked for a defined bridge. That bridge had been rejected. Harry reacted differently. When he received the answer, anger came first. He believed his wife had been treated more harshly than others, whose arrangements had been handled flexibly. Harry's frustration became personal. He did not hear a sovereign making an institutional judgment. He heard a father closing another door on his family. Charles felt the opposite pressure. He believed that allowing an exception would blur the line between independence and official royal authority. But Harry's fury had not begun with this proposal. An earlier confrontation involving Meghan, a palace-backed initiative, and a request Charles believed had already been settled, was still hanging over them. Before Harry could challenge his father directly, one uncomfortable question moved to the center of everything. Why had this demand become so personal to all three of them? For Charles, the argument was about the crown. For Meghan, it was about recognition. For Harry, it was about something far more painful: the belief that his family was once again deciding where his wife belonged without allowing him to protect her. That difference matters, because behind the palace terminology were three people carrying completely different versions of the same history. And when those versions collided, compromise became almost impossible. Charles carried a burden Harry could not easily separate from fatherhood. The crown, meaning the monarchy as an institution rather than simply the person wearing the crown, demanded rules that could survive family emotion. The king believed affection for his son could not automatically become official access, patronage, or public representation. Meghan saw the boundary differently. Her marriage, charitable work, public profile, and years inside royal life had created a connection she believed could not simply be erased by administrative distance. Harry felt the refusal land like an old wound reopening. Alone after receiving the decision, he called Meghan and tried to keep his voice steady as he explained how final his father had sounded. He told her there would be no secondary approach through palace staff, no revised wording, no softer version sent quietly later. The prince had believed their request was narrow enough to avoid restoring full working royal status. To him, That made the rejection feel harsher, not cleaner. Meghan did not explode. She went quiet. That silence unsettled Harry, because disappointment was hardening into something colder: resolve. She had expected resistance, but not a complete refusal to discuss any limited role at all. The Duchess understood that a working royal is a family member who performs official duties on behalf of the monarch, and she had not asked to return to that position. She had asked for a defined connection. Charles, however, feared even that smaller bridge could reopen the question of who was entitled to speak with royal authority while living independently of palace control. Harry ended the call, walked away, then returned seconds later. His humiliation had become anger. He told Meghan he would speak to his father directly rather than accept a decision delivered through aides. She did not stop him, but she warned that the argument was no longer only about one request. The king had drawn a line, and the prince was preparing to test it. Yet Charles had not drawn that line suddenly. Months earlier, one specific royal initiative had ended in a tense private meeting that changed his willingness to negotiate. To understand why he refused even a compromise now, the story has to return to the moment an awkward disagreement became a royal red line. The decisive fracture began long before Charles uttered the word "enough." It started during a private discussion over a proposed charitable initiative, an arrangement that appeared modest until one phrase changed everything. Meghan wanted the project publicly connected to her royal identity. Palace officials wanted absolute separation between private ventures and crown representation. Harry defended her immediately. Charles remained calm. But when the same proposal returned after he believed it had been settled, patience inside the palace disappeared. Charles had spent months trying to hold one line without turning it into a family insult. Crown representation, meaning the right to appear or act with the authority of the monarchy, carried weight far beyond a name on a program. If a private project looked officially royal, governments, charities, and the public could reasonably assume palace approval. Meghan believed her years inside the family and her charitable work gave her a lasting connection. Harry believed every effort she made to preserve that connection was being treated with suspicion. The tension finally broke at Windsor. Meghan asked that her name and Duchess title appear beside a palace-supported charitable program, arguing that the association reflected work she had already helped champion. Charles answered that the project could continue, but only without language suggesting crown sponsorship. Harry challenged the condition immediately. He insisted that stripping away the royal link changed the meaning of the entire proposal. The king heard him out, but the old frustration returned. His son was once again treating an institutional limit as a personal rejection. Charles closed the folder before the discussion had truly cooled. "We have already answered this," he said. Harry remained seated, stunned by how abruptly the meeting had ended. Meghan understood the message just as clearly. To her, the refusal felt less like a technical restriction and more like exclusion from a world she had once represented. To the monarch, however, the pressure had become impossible to ignore. He feared that every exception would create a new argument over who could claim royal authority while living beyond palace control. Weeks later, the issue returned. A revised proposal reached the palace through a different channel, but the wording carried the same underlying request. Charles recognized it instantly. He saw not compromise, but an attempt to reopen a decision he believed had already been settled. Harry remembered the earlier meeting as disrespect. Meghan remembered the sudden ending. The king remembered the repeated pressure. For all three, the dispute was no longer about one program. It had become a test of belonging, authority, and trust. That unfinished argument now returned with greater force. And this time, Harry was determined that his father would hear his anger face to face. Harry did not want another carefully worded message. He wanted his father. When the two finally spoke privately, Years of unresolved anger entered the room before either man reached the subject of Meghan's proposal. Charles insisted he had made an institutional decision. Harry heard something entirely different: a father closing another door on his son's family. Then came the accusation neither man could easily take back, and the confrontation stopped being about royal procedure. Harry demanded to know why the limited request had been shut down so completely. He argued that Meghan was not asking to return as a full working royal, but to keep a narrow connection to selected royal initiatives. Charles refused to soften the answer. The monarchy, meaning the institution that carries the crown's official authority, could not allow private independence and official representation to overlap whenever it became convenient. To him, unclear boundaries risked confusing the public and weakening the rules everyone else was expected to follow. Harry's anger sharpened. He accused his father of treating Meghan's involvement as uniquely dangerous, as though every attempt she made to preserve a connection had to be contained. The prince said repeated exclusions had damaged remaining trust between them. Charles listened, but his restraint was thinning. He told his son that affection could not become policy, and that guilt could not decide how the crown operated. The king believed he was being forced to choose between comforting Harry as a father and remaining consistent as sovereign. Harry then revealed why he had expected negotiation. He believed an earlier private conversation had left the door open to limited cooperation. Charles contradicted him. Warmth was not permission. A personal exchange between father and son was never authorization for renewed royal status, and the monarch said he had never promised otherwise. That distinction struck Harry like another rejection. Harry rose from his chair as the argument peaked. Charles remained seated until the room fell quiet. Then he looked at his son and said, "You are asking me as your father to undo what I must defend as king." The words stopped the argument for a moment, but they did not heal it. Harry was furious. Yet beneath that fury sat something more painful: the feeling that his father had chosen the institution over him once again. Charles looked drained after Harry left. He did not celebrate the silence that followed. Instead, he summoned a senior aide and asked for the disputed boundaries to be put into unmistakable terms. Verbal understandings were no longer enough. Harry believed the confrontation had ended with a refusal. In reality, Charles was about to turn that refusal into something far harder to reverse. After Harry left, Charles did not shout. He did something more consequential. He asked for the proposal to be returned, read the disputed language again, and instructed his advisors to formalize the boundary he had just defended. No retaliatory spectacle. No dramatic public statement. Just a sovereign making sure the same request could not return under another heading. And for Harry, that quiet administrative decision would soon feel more devastating than the argument itself. Charles understood where his real authority rested. It was not in winning a private argument with his son, but in deciding what could legitimately carry palace approval and royal association. Crown-sanctioned work, meaning activity formally approved as representing the monarchy, had to remain separate from projects controlled independently by Harry and Meghan. The king believed case-by-case exceptions had created too much confusion. If one private venture appeared royal, every future venture could raise the same question again. Charles hesitated when the final wording reached him. He knew Harry would read the instruction as punishment, even though he saw it as institutional housekeeping. A trusted advisor asked whether he wanted more time before approving it. The monarch looked back at the disputed lines and answered that delay would not create peace. It would only invite another confrontation. His certainty was quiet, but the cost of it was deeply personal. The king signed the internal instruction and kept the pen in his hand for several seconds. The order was specific. Future Sussex proposals could not imply palace sponsorship, official representation, or renewed working royal functions without direct sovereign approval. Palace sponsorship meant clear institutional backing from the monarch and his household. Charles then added one request of his own. He wanted no triumphant language attached to the decision. Harry was still his son, Meghan was still part of the wider family, and he refused to turn a boundary into a public humiliation. That distinction mattered more than anyone outside the room could see. Charles was not removing Harry and Meghan from the family. He was separating personal belonging from official authority. Yet that was exactly the line Harry had struggled to accept, because royal identity and family identity had been intertwined for most of his life. The king knew clarity could deepen the fracture before it healed anything at all, long after this argument had ended. Across the Atlantic, Harry prepared himself for another fight. But Meghan's response to the new boundary was not what he expected. She was calmer than he was, and that difference was about to force him to confront a far more uncomfortable question. Was his anger still protecting her, or was it preserving his own battle with the palace? Harry expected Meghan to be furious. Instead, she became quiet. That unsettled him more than anger would have. While he paced and spoke about humiliation, unfair treatment, and another closed palace door, she focused on what the decision actually meant. The answer was painful but simple. Charles had made the separation unmistakable. And suddenly, the argument was no longer only Meghan versus the monarchy. It was Harry versus a reality he had spent years resisting. Harry had just received confirmation that the king's refusal was no longer limited to one proposal. The decision had become a procedural boundary, meaning a formal rule shaping how future requests would be handled rather than a single rejection. That mattered because the original idea could no longer be rewritten and quietly returned under different language. Meghan understood the deeper consequence immediately. Continuing to seek a semi-official royal connection could leave them emotionally dependent on an institution they had publicly chosen to leave. Harry reacted as though the final door had been slammed in his face. He insisted they should challenge the decision privately, demand another conversation, and force the palace to explain why their circumstances were treated differently. Meghan listened until his anger began repeating itself. Then she told him something he was not prepared to hear. Every new confrontation had a cost. She was disappointed, deeply so, but she refused to let another rejection become the center of their life. Meghan's calm changed the argument completely. Harry had believed he was defending her, yet she was already beginning to accept what the palace had decided. The Duchess could see that fighting endlessly for symbolic recognition might give the institution even greater control over their emotions. The prince could not let go so easily. For him, Charles's decision carried years of unresolved hurt, old grievances, and the painful belief that his father still had the power to decide whether his choices were worthy of acceptance. Harry stopped pacing when Meghan finally asked the question that cut through everything. "Are you angry because they said no to me, or because he said no to you?" Silence followed. The words stripped away titles, procedures, and arguments about fairness. He could no longer hide behind the proposal itself. Meghan had wanted recognition, but Harry wanted something harder to name: acknowledgement from his father that the past had wounded him. The king had refused a royal arrangement. The son was still hearing a personal rejection. For the first time, the conflict had been stripped of titles and procedures, and what remained was a son who still needed an answer from his father. Their second conversation was nothing like the first. No proposal sat between them. No advisor waited to translate what either man meant. Harry spoke not about Meghan's royal role, but about the feeling that every closed institutional door had become another judgment on his life. Charles did not reverse his decision. That mattered. But neither did he hide behind procedure. For once, father and son confronted the wound beneath the argument, and discovered that agreement and reconciliation were not the same thing. Harry contacted Charles after Meghan's question had stayed with him longer than he expected. This time, he did not ask for the proposal to be reconsidered. He asked to speak as a son. The king agreed, but set one condition before the conversation went further. The royal decision itself would not be renegotiated. A sovereign decision, meaning an official choice made under the monarch's authority, could remain fixed, even while the personal relationship around it was discussed. That distinction was painful, but it gave both men somewhere honest to begin. Harry finally said what the earlier argument had hidden. Every institutional refusal felt personal, because he had spent his entire life struggling to separate the prince from the man underneath. When the palace rejected Meghan, he felt judged too. When Charles drew a boundary around official royal life, his son heard a father deciding where he belonged. The prince did not defend every angry word he had used, but he admitted that the anger came from years of feeling that family love and royal approval had become impossible to separate. Charles did not interrupt. Then he admitted something Harry had rarely heard expressed so plainly. Becoming sovereign had made the separation harsher, not easier. The king could love his son and still deny him something as monarch. He could care about Meghan and still refuse a formal palace connection. He told Harry the decision was not punishment, and there would be no attempt to erase their private place within the family simply because an official request had failed. Harry sat with that answer. He still disagreed. He still believed Meghan had been treated unfairly, but he stopped demanding that the decision be reversed. After a long silence, the prince finally said, "I still think you're wrong." Charles answered simply, "You are allowed to." Neither man left satisfied, yet neither left shouting. Harry felt grief replacing rage, while his father felt relief without victory. That was the first true shift. The family had finally lowered its voice, just as the outside world began raising its own. By morning, a private boundary had become a public spectacle. Newspapers reduced months of tension to a single explosive idea. Charles had finally said no. Supporters of the king called it institutional clarity. Sussex supporters saw another act of exclusion. Broadcasters debated titles, privilege, family loyalty, and whether reconciliation had become impossible. Yet beneath the noise, one image captured the strange reality of the crisis. The palace gates remained unchanged, while the definition of who stood inside them had shifted dramatically. Harry watched the argument escape his control. Headlines turned months of private frustration into a simple contest between rebellion and authority. And he understood that every angry word now served whichever side already believed it was right. A working royal, meaning a family member who performs official duties on behalf of the monarch, had become the center of public debate, because Meghan no longer held that role. Charles faced the opposite pressure. He wanted the public to understand that the decision concerned institutional consistency, not personal revenge. Charles saw one London front page at breakfast and immediately disliked its tone. Across the top ran the fictional banner, "The King draws the line." The king folded the newspaper closed and said he did not consider what had happened a victory. For him, triumphalism missed the human cost. Harry was still his son. Meghan remained part of the wider family, and a clearer royal boundary did not erase the damage created by years of conflict. Outside Buckingham Palace, a broadcaster framed the dispute in sharper terms, describing it as a boundary around the crown, not a banishment from the family. The crown here meant the monarchy's official authority and public role, not merely the physical crown worn at ceremonies. A small crowd gathered at the railings. Some applauded Charles for drawing a firm line. Others carried signs supporting Harry and Meghan. The same decision had become two completely different stories depending on who was telling it. Meghan, meanwhile, chose silence, and that restraint mattered. She refused to turn Charles's decision into another public confrontation, even as debate intensified publicly around her. Harry felt exhausted watching personal pain become public entertainment. Charles felt something close to sadness, as commentators treated restraint as strategy and silence as hidden warfare. Yet one detail slowly attracted attention. Neither side escalated. No retaliatory statement arrived from Harry. No personal attack came from the palace. The absence of fresh blows suggested that the second conversation between father and son had changed something important. The public kept searching for a winner, but the people at the center no longer saw one. And that contradiction, public triumph surrounding private loss, reveals what Charles' enough ultimately meant. In the end, Charles did not reverse the decision. Meghan did not receive the renewed palace connection she had sought. Harry did not force another negotiation. Those facts remained unchanged. But something else changed beneath them. The king finally separated personal affection from royal authority in language his son could no longer misunderstand. Meghan accepted that her future influence would have to stand independently of palace recognition. And Harry was left facing the hardest truth of all. Fury could not rebuild what years of conflict had broken. Charles held firm because the issue had grown larger than one request. Official crown representation, meaning permission to act with the monarchy's authority, would remain separate from independent Sussex projects. This mattered because blurred roles could create confusion over who spoke for the sovereign and who acted privately. The king also refused to turn that boundary into exile. Family ties would remain personal, even when royal duties remained closed. Meghan made her own decision. She would not send another version of the proposal, search for another route through palace staff, or reshape the same request under softer language. The choice hurt. She understood the contradiction. Independence meant little if her future still depended on approval from the institution she had left. Harry struggled longer. He accepted the answer without agreeing with it, and the anger that once drove him toward another confrontation gave way to sadness. Harry spoke with Charles again about the matter. The prince did not demand reconsideration. His father repeated that the decision would remain, but he also made clear that disagreement did not erase their private bond. A sovereign boundary was an official limit set by the monarch, not a declaration that someone had ceased to be family. Harry paused. He believed the king had been too rigid, yet he finally understood that no further argument would alter the outcome. Charles carried regret without uncertainty. Meghan chose independence over another appeal. Harry left disappointed, but he no longer treated every royal boundary as a battle he had to win. The word enough had ultimately applied to more than one demand. It ended years of ambiguity, repeated exceptions, and endless attempts to make family affection perform the work of royal policy. There would be no dramatic restoration and no final act of revenge. Charles had closed the institutional door without closing the family one. Meghan's demand ended there. Harry's eruption ended there too. The crown had chosen boundaries, while the family, however damaged, chose not to turn those boundaries into permanent war. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.